In 2022, the Russian invasion of Ukraine sent shockwaves throughout the international community, resulting in one of the largest coordinated sanctions regimes in modern history. Governments, corporations, and institutions around the world moved swiftly to impose severe financial, economic, and trade restrictions on Russia. These sanctions were meant to isolate Russia, cripple its economy, and put pressure on the Kremlin to withdraw from Ukraine. However, sanctions rarely affect only governments or military elites. Ordinary citizens often find themselves caught in the crossfire, bearing the brunt of the economic fallout. In this video, we'll explore how the global sanctions imposed in response to the Ukraine-Russia war have impacted the daily lives of average Russians. We'll cover a range of effects, including rising inflation, unemployment, shortages of goods, declining living standards, and growing isolation from the global economy. We'll also look at how Russian society is responding, both in terms of resilience and resistance. Let's take a closer look at the impact of sanctions on the everyday Russian. To understand the depth of the impact, it's important to first look at the scope and scale of the sanctions. In the aftermath of the invasion of Ukraine, the sanctions on Russia came in waves. Countries like the United States, the European Union, the United Kingdom, Japan, and Canada, along with numerous other allies, imposed sanctions targeting major Russian financial institutions, oligarchs, and businesses. The sanctions blocked Russia's access to Western financial markets, froze assets of individuals close to the Kremlin, banned exports of key technologies, and severely restricted Russia's ability to import and export critical goods. One of the most significant moves was the exclusion of several Russian banks from SWIFT, the global messaging system that underpins international financial transactions. This effectively crippled Russia's ability to conduct international trade and access foreign reserves. In addition to these government-imposed sanctions, multinational corporations across various industries began to pull out of Russia, halting operations or completely divesting from the country. Major brands like McDonald's, Starbucks, and Apple closed stores or paused services, marking a major shift in the Russian consumer landscape. One of the most immediate and palpable effects of the sanctions was the rapid rise in inflation. By early 2022, inflation in Russia had surged to double digits, reaching as high as 17–18%, the highest it had been in over 2 decades. The ruble's value plummeted in the first weeks of the invasion, though it later stabilized due to government intervention. Despite this, the costs of basic goods soared, particularly imported products that became harder or impossible to source. For ordinary Russians, this meant that everyday essentials, from food to fuel, became significantly more expensive. Items like sugar, cooking oil, meat, and vegetables saw sharp price increases, putting immense pressure on household budgets. With wages not keeping pace with inflation, many Russians found themselves struggling to maintain their standard of living. Imported goods, which had become staples for middle-class Russians over the years, also became scarce. Electronics, clothing, and even basic household items, many of which were previously imported from Europe, the US, or Asia, became either prohibitively expensive or unavailable altogether. Russian consumers were forced to turn to local alternatives, which were often of lower quality or higher cost. The departure of Western companies from the Russian market resulted in a wave of layoffs and business closures. When McDonald's announced that it was suspending operations in Russia, it affected tens of thousands of jobs across the country. This was emblematic of a larger trend, as major international firms in the tech, retail, automotive, and entertainment sectors followed suit. For example, companies like IKEA, which had a significant presence in Russia, shuttered stores, leading to job losses in retail and logistics sectors. The automobile industry was hit especially hard, with companies like Renault, Ford, and Toyota halting production or pulling out of the market. With parts and supplies disrupted by sanctions, even Russian-owned businesses faced challenges in maintaining operations. The wave of unemployment and business closures also affected ancillary services. For instance, industries dependent on foreign tourism, like hospitality, travel agencies, and cultural centers, saw their customer base dwindle as Western tourists disappeared. Small businesses, which form a backbone of many urban economies, also suffered. Restaurants, shops, and service providers reliant on imported goods or international clientele found themselves struggling to stay afloat. The combination of rising costs and reduced consumer spending led to widespread uncertainty for many entrepreneurs. For decades, Russia had become increasingly integrated into the global marketplace, particularly after the end of the Cold War. Russian consumers had access to a wide range of products from around the world, from smartphones to luxury goods to specialty foods. However, sanctions and the withdrawal of foreign companies led to a collapse in consumer choice. Electronics stores found themselves with dwindling supplies of popular brands like Apple, Samsung, and Sony, with no clear alternatives available. Prices for remaining products skyrocketed due to scarcity, making even mid-tier gadgets and appliances unaffordable for many. Clothing and fashion, too, were affected, with brands like Zara, H&M, and Uniqlo suspending operations. Russian shoppers, particularly in major cities like Moscow and St. Petersburg, who had become accustomed to a wide array of international brands, suddenly found their choices limited to domestic products or high-priced imports from non-Western countries. In response, the Russian government promoted import substitution, the idea that Russia should produce its own goods to replace those no longer available from abroad. However, in many cases, domestic alternatives lagged in quality and affordability. The gap between what consumers wanted and what was available grew wider, and the Russian middle class, which had grown accustomed to a modern, consumer-driven lifestyle, felt the loss keenly. The healthcare sector was also deeply affected by sanctions, particularly in terms of access to medicines and medical equipment. Russia relies heavily on imports for many specialized medicines, advanced medical devices, and treatments. Sanctions disrupted supply chains, leading to shortages of essential drugs like insulin, chemotherapy medications, and heart disease treatments. Many Russians, particularly those with chronic illnesses, faced uncertainty about whether they would be able to continue their treatments. Hospitals and clinics struggled to obtain advanced medical equipment, much of which was imported from Europe or the United States. The lack of access to parts and repairs for existing machines made it difficult for doctors to provide the same level of care. In response, the Russian government attempted to source medical supplies from non-Western countries, such as China and India. While this provided some relief, it often came at the expense of quality, as not all foreign alternatives met the same medical standards. The disruption of healthcare services has had a ripple effect on the broader population. For many Russians, the loss of access to Western medicines and treatments is one of the most significant and personal consequences of the sanctions regime. One of the more unexpected areas of impact has been in the digital and tech sectors. For years, Russian consumers had access to the same digital platforms, apps, and services as the rest of the world, from Netflix to Spotify to Instagram. However, following the imposition of sanctions, many of these platforms pulled out of Russia, leading to a kind of digital isolation. Popular entertainment platforms like Netflix and Disney Plus were no longer accessible, leaving Russians cut off from global content. Social media platforms, such as Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, were blocked or heavily restricted by both the Russian government and the platforms themselves in response to the war. For many Russians, this created a sense of cultural and informational isolation. In addition to entertainment, the tech sector was hit hard by the withdrawal of major companies like Microsoft, Apple, and Google. Tech companies stopped providing software updates, cloud services, and hardware support to Russian customers, leading to significant challenges for both individual consumers and businesses. For Russians working in tech, particularly those involved in international projects or startups, this was a major blow. The restriction of access to global markets, platforms, and tools created barriers to innovation and development. Many Russian tech professionals found themselves considering emigration to continue their careers abroad. Beyond the economic and material impacts, the sanctions have had a profound psychological effect on many Russians. For years, Russia had become increasingly interconnected with the global community. Travel, cultural exchange, international business, and digital connectivity made it possible for ordinary Russians to feel like part of a larger, globalized world. The sudden isolation created by sanctions, the departure of Western businesses, and the restrictions on travel have led to a sense of cultural alienation for many. Young, urban Russians, in particular, who had grown up with access to global culture and who often traveled or worked abroad, found themselves suddenly cut off. There is also a growing feeling of resentment and frustration. Many Russians, even those who may not support the war, feel unfairly punished by the sanctions. They question why ordinary citizens, many of whom have no control over the actions of their government, should bear the consequences. This psychological impact has manifested in various ways. Some Russians have retreated into nationalist sentiment, seeing the sanctions as confirmation of a Western conspiracy against their country. Others have expressed despair and hopelessness, feeling that the future they had envisioned is slipping away. Despite the challenges, Russians are known for their resilience in the face of adversity. Many have adapted to the new reality by finding creative solutions. For example, Russian entrepreneurs have stepped in to fill the void left by departing Western brands, offering domestic alternatives or sourcing goods from countries not participating in the sanctions. In the tech sector, Russian developers have started building alternatives to popular Western platforms. vKontakte, a Russian social media platform, has seen a surge in users following the departure of Facebook and Instagram. Yandex, Russia's largest search engine, has expanded its ecosystem to offer services that mirror those of Google. There has also been a rise in informal markets and black market activity, as Russians find ways to obtain restricted or banned goods. This has led to a parallel economy, where goods and services that are unavailable through official channels can still be accessed, albeit at a higher cost. The impact of sanctions on everyday Russians is profound and multifaceted. From rising prices and unemployment to isolation from global culture and technology, the sanctions have touched nearly every aspect of life for the average citizen. While the Russian government continues to project strength and resilience, the reality on the ground tells a more complicated story. For now, many Russians are doing what they've always done in times of hardship, adapting, surviving, and finding ways to make the best of a difficult situation. However, the long-term effects of this isolation and economic hardship are still unfolding. As the war in Ukraine continues and sanctions remain in place, the daily lives of Russians will likely continue to be shaped by these far-reaching policies. The key question moving forward is whether this pressure will lead to significant political change within Russia, or whether the Russian people will continue to endure these hardships without a major shift in the country's trajectory. Only time will tell.